She came to Wyoming with nothing but the clothes on her back and a name that had been dragged through every hospital corridor on the East Coast. Evelyn Harper, disgraced, starving, and so cold she couldn't feel her own fingers anymore, sat alone in a train station at the edge of the world and wondered if this was how it ended. Not with a fight, not with a last stand, just a woman slowly going numb on a wooden bench while a blizzard buried the last road out. She had survived humiliation, she had survived betrayal, but she wasn't sure she could survive Wyoming. If this story moves you, hit like, drop a comment with your city, and let me see how far this journey has traveled. The train station at Millhaven, Wyoming, was barely a building. 3 walls of raw timber, a fourth that was mostly gaps where the wind came through, a potbelly stove in the corner that had been cold for hours, and a bench that ran the length of the east wall where 3 other passengers had been sitting when Evelyn arrived. Those 3 were long gone. She hadn't noticed them leaving. She had been too focused on not shaking apart. It was December 1887, and the blizzard outside had gone from something a person could dismiss to something that had weight and intention. Snow packed itself against the single window until the glass was opaque. The wind found every crack in the timber walls and pushed through like it owned the place. Evelyn sat with her coat pulled around her shoulders and her bag on the bench beside her. The bag was not heavy. It held 2 dresses, a pair of boots with a loose heel, her nursing instruments wrapped in cloth, forceps, scissors, a probe, a small leather case of suture needles that she'd had for 11 years, and a letter of dismissal from the offices of Dr. Victor Langston, senior surgeon, Massachusetts General Hospital. She had kept the letter because she'd told herself it would remind her to be careful. It had not made her careful. It had only made her angry, and the anger had kept her moving until the money ran out, which happened 3 states west of anywhere she'd planned to stop. She had meant to go to San Francisco. She'd had $42 when she left Boston. By the time she reached Millhaven, she had 11 cents and a train ticket that terminated here, because here was as far as 11 cents and a sold-down ticket could take a woman. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was watching them to make sure they were still moving when she told them to, which was becoming less reliable. She flexed her fingers. They responded, but slowly, like something mechanical that needed oil. Don't be dramatic, she thought. You are not dying. You are cold and you are hungry, and you are in Wyoming, which is arguably a form of dying, but you are not actually dying. She'd last eaten the day before. Half a biscuit purchased from a woman on the train platform in Laramie, who had taken one look at Evelyn and charged her 10 cents for something worth maybe 3. Evelyn had paid it because she was past the point of pride. She was not, however, past the point of noticing. The door opened, not gently. The wind hit it first and threw it back against the wall with a crack that made Evelyn flinch. And then a man stepped in and put his shoulder against it and shoved it closed again, which took real effort. He stood there for a moment, breathing hard, snow covering his hat and the shoulders of his coat. He was tall, wide through the chest, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than intention. His coat was sheepskin, worn at the collar. His hat was dark wool, battered. He pulled it off and knocked it against his leg and looked at the empty station. His eyes found her on the bench. He didn't say anything immediately. He crossed to the dead stove, checked it, found it cold, and looked around for wood. There was none. He looked back at her. "You been here long?" His voice was low and direct. Not unfriendly, but not warm either. The voice of a man who asked questions because he needed information, not because he was making conversation. "Since this afternoon," Evelyn said. Her voice came out thinner than she intended. She cleared her throat. "The afternoon stage didn't run. Stage hasn't run in 3 days. Larson probably told you that when you bought the ticket." "Larson didn't tell me anything." That sounds like Larson. He looked at the window, which was completely white with packed snow. You got someone coming to meet you? No. He looked at her again, not rudely, more the way a man looks at something he's trying to accurately assess. Where are you headed? She stopped. The honest answer was nowhere in particular, which was not something she was going to say out loud to a stranger in a blizzard. I was told there might be work in the area. Medical work. I'm a nurse. The man studied her for another moment. His expression didn't change much, but something shifted behind it. You're a nurse, he said. Yes. From where? Boston. Most recently. She met his eyes. Before that, various places? He put his hat back on. My name is Wade Callahan. I run the Double C, about 9 miles north of here. We've got a bunkhouse that's warm and a cook who makes food that's edible most of the time. He paused. I'm not in the habit of leaving people in train stations in December. Evelyn looked at him carefully. She had learned, the hard way, repeatedly, that generosity from strangers usually costs something. What would you want in return? He seemed mildly surprised by the question, or maybe just by the directness of it. I've got 2 men down with something that started as a chest cold. My regular, the man who handles whatever doctoring gets done out here, rode out to Cheyenne 6 weeks ago and hasn't come back. If you're actually a nurse, that's useful. I am actually a nurse. Then we'd call it fair exchange. Room and board for however long the weather holds. And you look at my men. Evelyn stood up. Her knees were stiff and she moved carefully, but she stood. She picked up her bag. All right, she said. The ride was 9 miles through a blizzard, which in practical terms meant Evelyn spent 40 minutes on the bench seat of a buckboard with her face buried in her coat collar, unable to see more than 3 feet in any direction, while the horses found their own way home because Wade was navigating by memory and instinct rather than anything visible. She did not ask how he knew where he was going. She had decided, somewhere around the 2nd mile, that asking questions she couldn't do anything about was a waste of energy she didn't have. The ranch appeared out of the snow as a collection of lights, yellow squares in the dark that became windows, which became a large house, and then several outbuildings and then a barn with a lantern above the door. Dogs barked somewhere. A figure moved between 2 buildings, then stopped and turned to watch the buckboard come in. Wade pulled up near the house and climbed down and came around to her side without being asked. She accepted his hand getting down because she wasn't sure her legs would hold otherwise. They held. She released his hand and stepped back. Bunkhouse is through there, he pointed. I'll take you to see the sick men first. I'd appreciate that. He gave her a look that might have been something close to approval, or it might have been nothing. It was difficult to read him, which she filed away as something to pay attention to. The bunkhouse was a long building with 12 cots along the walls, a central stove that was burning properly, and the smell of men and wood smoke and something medicinal that had been applied without much medical knowledge. 8 men were present, 6 on their cots in various states of rest, 2 playing cards at a table near the stove who looked up when Wade and Evelyn came in and said nothing. Marsh, Connolly. Wade stopped at 2 cots on the far end. This is Miss Harper. She's a nurse. She's going to look at you. The man called Marsh was maybe 30, with a red beard and the kind of face that looked like it was usually cheerful and was currently not. He was propped on one elbow looking at Evelyn with naked suspicion. Where'd you come from? He asked. The train station, Evelyn said. She was already setting her bag down and opening it. I need better light. There's a lamp on the hook there. I see it. Can someone bring it closer? A pause. Then one of the card players got up and moved the lamp without being asked again, which Evelyn noted. She turned to Marsh and put her hand on his forehead without preamble. hot. She moved to his throat, pressed gently along his glands, watched his face. When did this start? Week and a half ago? Chest pain? Some? Some meaning occasional, or some meaning you're afraid to breathe too deep. He looked at her sideways. Second one. Coughing? Yeah. What are you bringing up? Nothing you want described. Mr. Marsh, I've been a nurse for 11 years. You're not going to disturb me. He described it. She listened, noted it, moved to his chest and pressed her ear against his back and told him to breathe, and then tried not to show anything when she heard what she heard, which was fluid in the lower left lobe. Not catastrophic, not yet, but moving in a direction she didn't like. She moved to Connolly, who was younger and quieter, and had the waxy look of someone running a fever that had been going longer than it should. She went through the same assessment. Connolly's breathing was worse than Marsh's. Is there a medical kit on this ranch? She asked, turning to Wade. There's a box in the main house, some bandages, some carbolic acid, laudanum, a few other things. I need to see it. I also need to know if there's a way to get anything from town. Not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow. Then we work with what's here. She looked at the two card players. Either of you willing to help? They looked at each other. The taller one shrugged. I guess. Good. I need a clean cloth, the hottest water you can get me from that stove, and I need the windows on this side cracked. She saw the look. I know it's cold outside. It's more important that these men have air that moves. A sick lung in a sealed room is worse off than a sick lung in cold air. Trust me or don't, but if you trust me, do it now. Wade watched her from near the door. He didn't interfere. He didn't question. He watched, which was different from both of those things, and Evelyn found, to her own mild surprise, that she didn't mind it. No. She worked until past midnight. When she finally came out of the bunkhouse, the blizzard had dropped to a steady snowfall, and the yard between the buildings was white and silent. Wade was sitting on the porch of the main house with his coat on and a cup of something hot in his hands. Well, he said, Connolly has pneumonia. Early stage, I think, but it needs to be watched. Marsh is close behind him. I've got them both on a schedule, steam compresses, positioning to help the fluid move, something for the fever. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. I need better supplies than what's in that box. When the weather breaks. First thing, he said. She nodded. She was tired in a way that went past her bones. The kind of tired that had been accumulating for months and had only now found a moment to present itself. There's a room off the kitchen, Wade said. Small. My housekeeper used it before she moved to town. It's yours if you want it. Thank you. She went inside. The room was small. A cot, a washstand, a window that looked out on the barn. There was a quilt folded at the foot of the cot that had been made by someone who knew how to make quilts, and a small oil lamp on the washstand. And when Evelyn sat down on the edge of the cot and looked at the room, she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had slept in worse places. Quite recently, in fact. She took off her boots. She took the letter out of her bag, the one from Langston, and held it for a moment, the way she sometimes did, not reading it, but feeling the weight of it. A single page. It had ended 11 years of work in about 3 paragraphs. Conduct unbecoming, insubordination, actions detrimental to the reputation of this institution. What she had done, told the truth about a surgery gone wrong. What she had refused to do, sign a document saying the patient's death was due to pre-existing conditions unrelated to the procedure. Langston had needed her signature because she had been in the room. She had refused to give it. He had made a call to the nursing board and the hospital board and 2 colleagues on the medical licensing committee, and 6 days later she had a letter and no career. She set the letter down on the washstand. Conduct unbecoming, she thought. That's what they call it when you won't lie. She lay down on the cot without taking her dress off. She pulled the quilt over her. Outside, the snow fell. She did not sleep immediately. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch settle around her. The creak of the house, the distant sound of horses in the barn, the wind still moving across the roof. She thought about Connolly's breathing, which she didn't like. She thought about what she would need to get his temperature down and keep it there. She thought about the supply box and what she had to work with, running through it methodically. She did not think about what came next or what happened when the weather broke and she had to figure out what she was doing in Wyoming. That was a problem for tomorrow or the day after. Right now, there were 2 sick men in a bunkhouse, and she had a job to do, and having a job to do was the only thing that had ever reliably kept her upright. She slept. Morning came gray and cold. She was up before the cook, which appeared to be before anyone was up, and she was in the bunkhouse checking on her patients by the time the sky had lightened enough to see the ranch in full. She found Connolly had sweated through his sheets in the night, which was actually a decent sign. The fever was trying to break. She changed the compress, repositioned him, checked his breathing. Still wet, still labored, but not worse. Marsh was sitting up when she came to him. "You actually sleep here?" he asked. "I'm in the main house." "Huh." He watched her check his temperature. "You came from the train station." "You heard that last night?" "I know, I'm just—" He seemed to be deciding something. "We don't get a lot of people coming through who know what they're doing." "What's your usual arrangement?" "Doc Heller used to come out from Millhaven about once a month. He's old and half-blind and mostly just told people to rest and drink water. Before him there was a woman out on the Pruitt homestead who knew some things. She died 2 years ago." He paused. "Before that, I don't know. I've only been on this ranch 4 years. "Where were you before?" "Kansas, then Colorado. Followed the work." He looked at his hands. "You planning on staying?" Evelyn considered the question. It was a more complicated question than he knew. "I'm planning on making sure you and Connolly don't die," she said. "Beyond that, I haven't decided." Marsh made a sound that might have been a laugh. The blizzard kept the ranch sealed for 4 days. In those 4 days, Evelyn established a rhythm she hadn't had in months. She rose early, checked on Connolly and Marsh, managed their treatments through the morning. In the afternoons, when the cowboys were coming in from whatever tasks could be done in the snow, she was available in the bunkhouse for whatever minor things needed attention. A hand cut on a fence wire, a twisted ankle, a headache that had been going for 3 days and turned out to be a back molar that needed packing. The cowboys didn't warm to her immediately. She hadn't expected them to. They watched her the way people watch something they haven't categorized yet. Not hostile, but not open either. She answered their questions plainly when they asked them. She didn't try to make them like her. She just did the work. And after the first day or two, she noticed them starting to stop in the bunkhouse doorway to check on Marsh and Connolly without being asked, and she took that as a reasonable sign of progress. Wade she saw mostly in passing. He ran the ranch with a kind of methodical attention that she found, she searched for the right word, steady. He knew the name of every animal and every man on the property. He made decisions quickly and without visible second-guessing, but he listened before he decided, which not everyone did. He stopped in the bunkhouse morning and evening and asked her directly what she needed, not how the men were doing. He could see how the men were doing. What she needed was more useful information. On the 3rd morning, he appeared in the bunkhouse doorway with a wooden box she hadn't seen before. "Found this in the storage building," he said. "There used to be a medical setup in the old cabin on the east end of the property. The man who had this ranch before me ran it as a kind of treatment point for the homesteaders in the area. Stopped when he sold the place. Most of this stuff has been sitting for 6 years. He set the box down and Evelyn went through it carefully. Carbolic acid, still sealed, bandaging, a collection of instruments she recognized, probes, retractors, a set of forceps better than what she'd brought, a bottle of ether, which she handled cautiously and set aside. Medical thread. A small hand-printed log that turned out to be patient records, dates going back to 1879. She looked up at him. "There's a cabin? Down the East Trail, about half a mile. It's been empty since I bought the place. I use it for storage." Evelyn looked at the box, then at the patient log, then at the walls of the bunkhouse, which were not the right environment for what she was doing here. "I'd like to see it," she said. The cabin was stone and timber, maybe 20 feet by 15, with a low roof and a solid door that had frozen in its frame and required Wade putting his shoulder against it to open. It was cold inside and smelled of old wood and dust, but the structure was sound. There was a table in the center, heavy, oak, the right height, shelving along one wall, a window on the north side that let in good light when it wasn't frosted over, a small stove in the corner that was, when Wade cleaned the flue and she lit it, fully functional. Evelyn stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly. "I can work here," she said. "It'd need cleaning out." "I'll clean it out." He looked at her. "You'd be doing this on your own time." "Yes." "The men I hired you for are in the bunkhouse. They're improving. Connolly will be walking in another week. Marsh is already walking." She turned to face him. "But you said there used to be a treatment point here for the homesteaders in the area. Do they still need it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Most of them don't have anything else," he said finally. "Then give me access to this cabin, and I'll make it useful again." He looked around the room. She could see him running through some calculation, cost, logistics, whatever else a man running a ranch in 1887 Wyoming ran through when someone asked him for something. "All right," he said. "It's yours." The blizzard cleared on the 4th day, and on the 5th day the first homesteader arrived at the ranch gate without being sent for. He was a man named Pruitt, older, weathered, with a wife who had been running a fever for 8 days and getting worse. He'd heard something from one of Wade's cowboys who'd been out checking fence lines. He'd ridden 2.5 hours through the cold. Evelyn went to his house. The wife had pleurisy. Not pneumonia, but headed there without intervention. Evelyn spent 3 hours with her, started her on what treatment was possible with the supplies on hand, and gave Pruitt a list of things to watch for and instructions that were direct and specific because she had learned that vague instructions were useless. She was back at the ranch by dark. Wade was in the yard when she rode in. "How was she?" he said. "She'll need watching for another week, but she'll make it." He took the horse's reins without asking. "You rode out there alone." "You were busy." "I would have sent someone with you." Evelyn climbed down from the saddle and looked at him. "Mr. Callahan, I have been going places alone for 11 years. I appreciate the offer, but I don't require an escort." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was getting slightly better at reading. This particular one was not quite agreement, but not quite disagreement either. "There are things on this range that you're not used to," he said. "I expect there are." "I'm not trying to manage you. I know you're not, but I need to be able to move when I need to move." She met his eyes. "I also know this range belongs to you, and I'm operating here on your permission. I'm not forgetting that." A beat. "I'll have someone go with you when you need to cover distance," he said. "Not to watch over you, to know the ground." She considered that. It was actually reasonable. "That's fair," she said. She spent the rest of December restoring the cabin. It was not simple work. 6 years of disuse had left the interior in need of thorough cleaning, some structural repair around the doorframe, new shelving where the old had rotted, and a proper inventory of what was usable and what needed to be replaced. She did most of it herself, in whatever hours the patients didn't need, with intermittent help from whichever cowboy happened to be not actively useful elsewhere. Most of the help was reluctant and slightly bewildered, but it was help. By the last week of December, the cabin was functional. Not well stocked, not what she eventually wanted, but functional. Clean surfaces, organized supplies, the stove properly set up, the window clear. She stood in the doorway the evening she finished and looked at what she'd made and felt something that had been very quiet for a long time, something that lived somewhere in her chest, move slightly. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small shift, like a door unlocking. She had built something, or rebuilt something. She wasn't sure of the difference yet. It wasn't Boston. It wasn't what she'd had or what she'd planned or anything close to the career she'd been building for 11 years before one man's decision had swept it away. But it was a room with a table and good instruments and clean shelves, and she was a nurse, and there were people within 20 miles who had no one else. That was enough to start with. She did not know, standing in that doorway, that Victor Langston had received a letter from a colleague in Denver who had heard about a disgraced East Coast nurse working on a Wyoming ranch. She did not know that Langston still thought about her occasionally, not with guilt, which would have required a capacity he didn't fully have, but with the particular irritation of a man who felt that a loose end had not been properly tied off. She did not know that the boy who would bring everything to a crisis point was 17 years old and working the North Pasture fence line, and that in 5 months he would be caught under a piece of equipment that weighed 400 pounds, and that she would make a choice in that moment that would either save his life or end hers. She was just a woman standing in a doorway, looking at something she had built. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel like running. January came in hard. The temperature dropped so far below zero that the mercury in the thermometer outside the cabin door gave up and stopped moving, and the men stopped making jokes about the cold because there was nothing funny left to say about it. The horses needed extra feed and extra attention, and twice in the first week of the month, 2 of the ranch hands came in from fence checking with fingers that had gone white and waxy from frostbite. Evelyn thawed them out slowly, not with heat, which most people's instinct told them to use, and which was exactly wrong, but with cool water and careful pressure, and the men sat there hissing through their teeth and trying not to look like it hurt as much as it did. "Don't rub them," she said, for the second time in 3 days, to a cowboy named Deacon, whose right hand she was currently working on. "I know, you told me. You rubbed them anyway. I forgot. You'll remember now." Deacon was 24, rangy, with a habit of talking more than he thought before he spoke. He looked at her sideways while she worked. "How do you know all this?" 11 years of practice." "Where?" "Boston. Before that, Maryland. Before that, a field hospital in Pennsylvania." She paused. "I did 2 years with the surgical unit." That landed. She could see it register on his face, the recalibration, the slight widening of his assessment of her. "That's—" he started, stopped. "How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?" 34. He processed that. "So you started when you were—" 23, yes." She set down the cloth and looked at his hand. The color was coming back. "Good. You can flex your fingers, slowly." He did. He winced. "Still hurts." "It'll hurt for a few days. Keep them out of the cold for at least 48 hours. I've got fence work tomorrow. Then wrap them properly and don't stay out more than an hour at a stretch." She met his eyes. "If they go white again, come back immediately. You understand what I mean when I say immediately? Yeah. He looked at his hand. Then, after a pause, "You're all right, Miss Harper." It was not a grand statement. It was a cowboy who wasn't inclined to give compliments, telling her something plainly. She took it for what it was. "Thank you, Deacon," she said. The cabin was functioning by the second week of January. She'd organized the shelves by category: wound care, fever management, respiratory, tools, and kept a running inventory on a piece of paper tacked to the wall, so she always knew what she was low on and what needed to be requested when someone rode to Millhaven. Wade had established a simple arrangement. Whenever a ranch hand went to town for supplies, he carried Evelyn's list alongside the ranch list. It was not a formal agreement. It was just the way things were done now, which she found was often how things became permanent on a working ranch. The word spread in the way that news spread on the frontier side, not through newspapers or announcements, but through the quiet network of people who talked to each other at fence lines and trading posts and the water troughs at the edge of town. There was a nurse at the Double C. She knew what she was doing. She'd pulled Connolly back from pneumonia, and Connolly was a man people knew and trusted, and his testimony carried weight. They started coming in February. Not in large numbers. This was a sparse and spread out country, and people didn't travel easily in winter. But they came. A woman from the Aldridge homestead 12 miles east with a child who had an infected ear that had gone untreated too long. A man named Pharaoh, with a wound on his forearm from a saw blade that had been cleaned badly and was starting to show the red lines of spreading infection. Two sisters from a ranch she'd never heard of, both coughing, one of them worse than she let on. Evelyn treated them all. She charged nothing because most of them had nothing, and because Wade had not asked her to charge anything, and because she had understood for years since the field hospital in Pennsylvania, where the men she treated were 19 years old and had nothing in their pockets but letters from home, that medicine that required payment from people who couldn't pay wasn't really medicine. It was commerce wearing medicine's coat. The cowboys noticed the people coming. They didn't say anything about it directly, not to her, but she heard the conversation shift. There was less edge in the bunkhouse when she came in. Marsh, who was fully recovered and had gone back to work, had apparently said something to the newer men that she was never told directly, but that she could infer from the change in how they looked at her. Wade noticed too. He came to the cabin one evening in mid-February when the last patient of the day, the Pharaoh man, whose arm was finally looking clean, had ridden out, and he stood in the doorway and looked at the space with an expression she'd learned meant he was doing arithmetic in his head. "How many people have you seen out of that cabin this month?" he asked. 14, not counting ranch hands. He was quiet for a moment. "You keeping records?" "A log. Patient name, date, presenting complaint, treatment. Basic." She was cleaning her instruments at the table, setting them in the carbolic solution. "Do you want to see it?" "No." He came in a few steps, looked at the shelving. "What do you need that you don't have?" "Quinine. I'm nearly out, and there's at least one homestead family I know of that's going to need it come spring when the water gets warm. Laudanum, though I'm careful with that one. More carbolic. And I'd like a proper amputation kit, though I'm hoping not to need it." Amputation. A crush injury, a badly infected limb that's gone too far. It happens. Having the right tools doesn't mean I'll use them. It means if I have to, I can do it cleanly instead of badly. She set down the forceps and looked at him. "I know that sounds alarming." "It sounds practical," he said, which was not what she'd expected him to say. She looked at him for a moment. He was standing near the shelves with his hat in his hand. He always took his hat off in the cabin, which she'd noticed and not remarked on, and the lamplight made the angles of his face look less severe than they did in daylight. He was not a handsome man in the obvious way, not the kind of face that announced itself, but it was a face that held things steadily, and she had come to find that quality more valuable than she once had. "Wade," she said, and then stopped because she wasn't sure what she was going to say next. He waited. "What I'm doing here," she chose her words, "it's more than what you hired me for." "I know that. I want to make sure we're both clear on what it is." He considered that. "You're building something," he said. "I can see that. I'm not complaining about it. I want to take it further out. There are families I haven't been able to reach because I don't know the territory well enough. Pruitt told me about 2 homesteads on the North Ridge that haven't had any medical attention in 3 years. She paused. "I'd want to do regular rounds, not just when people come to me." "I'll put together a route with you," he said. "I know those ridges." She nodded. It was not a complicated conversation. That was something she'd noticed about him. He didn't make things complicated that didn't need to be, and he didn't need things spelled out at length before he understood them. After 11 years of working around men who needed to be convinced of everything, she found it quietly startling. "Thank you," she said. He put his hat back on. At the door, he stopped. "Connolly said you told him he'd make it from the first night." "I said his odds were reasonable." "He says you told him he'd make it." "I told him what he needed to hear. Those aren't always the same thing." Wade looked at her for a moment, and this time she was fairly sure she knew what was in his expression. It was something close to respect, not the performed kind, not the kind people gave women in polite society as a social nicety, but the real kind, the kind a person gave someone else when they'd watched them work and understood what the work actually required. "Good night, Miss Harper," he said. "Good night, Mr. Callahan." The door closed. Outside, the cold pressed against the cabin walls. Inside, the stove ticked steadily, and Evelyn stood at her work table in the lamplight and felt, carefully, the way you feel for something in the dark, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, closer to purpose. The sense that what she was doing with her hands in a given day was connected to something that mattered. She finished cleaning her instruments. She wrote up the day's log. She banked the stove and walked back to the main house through the cold and the dark. She slept well that night. Spring came late and muddy, the way it always did in Wyoming. Not gradually, not pleasantly, but in fits and retreats. A week of warmth followed by a late freeze, the ground thawing and refreezing and thawing again until the yard between the buildings was ankle-deep in mud that sucked at boots and swallowed tools set down carelessly. The men complained about it with the practiced ease of people who complained about weather the way others made small talk. Evelyn was moving by April. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times, she made rounds, north to the Ridge homesteads, east to the Aldridge and Faro places, south occasionally to a cluster of small farms near the river that had a bad habit of contaminated well water every spring. She rode better now. She had not been a confident rider when she arrived, and the first week she'd made it work through stubbornness rather than skill. By April, she was still not graceful on horseback, but she was competent, which was more useful than graceful. On the longer rides, Wade sometimes came with her, or sent a ranch hand who knew the terrain. In March, she had pushed back on this, and he had not pushed back on her pushing back. But the next ride she'd done alone, she'd gotten genuinely turned around in the dark, trying to find the second North Ridge homestead, and had ended up arriving an hour later than she planned in a cold rain, which was not ideal. She'd told him about it when she got back, flatly and without embellishment, because she didn't see the point of pretending. "I'll take you up there again before you do it solo," he'd said. Yes, all right. He hadn't made it into anything. She appreciated that. In April, 3 things happened that changed the character of what she was building. The first was the Henderson girl. 11 years old, kicked by a horse, Right leg broken in 2 places. Family homestead 19 miles from the ranch. By the time the father rode to the Double C and back with Evelyn, it had been 6 hours, and the girl was in the kind of pain that had moved past screaming into a terrible silent endurance that was worse than screaming. The break was bad. Both bones of the lower leg, one with a fragment displaced at an angle that was going to cause serious problems if she set it the usual way. Evelyn spent 2 hours with that leg. She set it by feel and by the girl's reactions, working slowly because fast was not an option when fast would mean a permanent limp or worse. When she was done, this girl's mother, a woman named Clara Henderson, who had stood in the corner of the room the whole time because she couldn't leave but also couldn't watch, came to Evelyn and took both her hands and held them without saying anything for a long moment. Her hands were shaking. "She'll walk normally," Evelyn said. "I need you to keep her still for 6 weeks. I mean, completely still. No exceptions, no matter what she tells you she feels up to." 6 weeks, Claire repeated. The displacement was significant. The bone needs time to knit in the right position before any weight goes on it. 6 weeks, then I'll come back and check it. Clara's eyes were bright. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just keep her still." The second thing was the cholera scare. Evelyn had been watching the river farms for weeks, checking water sources each time she visited, and in late April she found what she was looking for and didn't want to find: a well on the Taggart farm showing contamination that she recognized. She had seen it in a field hospital, and she had seen it in a Boston tenement outbreak, and she knew what it meant if it spread. She went straight back to the Double C and told Wade. "How serious?" he said. "Potentially very serious. It depends on how far the contamination goes and how fast we move." She was already thinking through the list. "I need to get to every farm on the South River this week. Not next week. This week. And I need you to help me draft a notice that can be distributed to anyone coming into Millhaven from the south. I can talk to the sheriff. He'll cooperate. Does the sheriff understand what cholera means? He'll understand it when I explain it to him." She looked at him. "Wade, I'm asking because I need this taken seriously right now, and I don't have time to spend 3 days convincing men in authority that I know what I'm talking about." He held her gaze. "I know you do. Write the notice. I'll make sure it moves." She wrote the notice that evening. Wade rode to Millhaven the next morning. Within 3 days, there was word going through the Southern Territory about the well contamination. 4 farms had already used the water. She got to all 4 of them. 3 showed no symptoms yet. The 4th had a grandmother and 2 children who were sick. She contained it. Not cleanly, not easily. There were 10 days in May that she pushed harder than she'd pushed since Pennsylvania, riding in rain, treating people in bad conditions, going back to check and recheck, telling people things they didn't want to hear about their water and their habits. But she contained it. The outbreak did not spread. When it was over, she sat down in the cabin and stared at the wall for about 20 minutes and felt a particular exhaustion that came from fighting something invisible. The third thing that happened in April was smaller, but in its own way, as significant as the other 2. A cowboy named Reyes, he'd been on the Double C for 2 years, one of the quietest men on the ranch, originally from Texas, came to the cabin one evening with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she had learned to recognize as something being held down. "What's wrong?" she said. "Nothing's wrong exactly." He didn't come in. He stood in the doorway. "My sister's family is up near Sheridan. Her husband wrote to say she's having a difficult time with a pregnancy. He doesn't say more than that. He doesn't know more than that, I think. What do you need from me?" "I don't know. He stopped. "Is there someone up near Sheridan who could help her if she needed it?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She thought about the network of names she'd been accumulating over 4 months. Women in isolated places who knew something, midwives who had learned by necessity, the circuit doctor in Casper who was 300 miles away. "Write down your sister's name and where exactly the family is," she said, "and tell me how far along she is if you know." 6 months, he said. "All right. I'll write a letter to a woman I know near Buffalo who is better with deliveries than I am. She may be closer. And if your brother-in-law writes again with more detail, bring it to me." Reyes looked at her. He was not a demonstrative man. "Thank you, Miss Harper." "Don't thank me yet. I'm writing a letter, not performing a miracle." "Still," he said. She watched him go. She thought about all the things she couldn't fix and the things she could. That gap never closed. She had learned that in Pennsylvania, and she had never unlearned it. What you could do was keep moving toward the things you could fix and not let the things you couldn't fix stop you entirely. She wrote the letter that night. By May, the medical cabin at the Double C had been visited by 43 people from beyond the ranch. By June, that number was 60. Wade had begun building a small waiting area outside the cabin door, a bench under a simple overhang, without discussing it with her first. She came out one morning and found him doing the carpentry himself, and she stood watching him work for a moment before she said anything. "You didn't tell me you were doing this. Figured you'd say it wasn't necessary." "I wouldn't have said that." He drove a nail. "You would have said you didn't want to put him to any trouble." She considered that. "I might have said that." "It's no trouble." He drove another nail. "People have been standing in the mud waiting. Makes sense to give them somewhere dry." She looked at the bench taking shape. "It needs to be long enough for a family. People come with their children. That's why I'm making it long." He didn't look up. She went back inside and started her day. And the bench was finished by evening, and the next morning an old man named Whitfield sat on it with his hat on his knees waiting for her to open the cabin, and she let him in first and treated the infection in his hand that he'd been ignoring for 3 weeks. And the whole thing felt, she could only call it, normal. Like this was simply how things were, like she had always been here. She still had the letter from Langston in the washstand drawer. She hadn't looked at it in a while. It was still there. She knew it was still there. But for the first time in years, it had stopped being the last thing she thought about before she slept. The summer of 1888 came in hot and dry, the kind of dry that cracked the earth into plates and turned the water in the creek to a slow brown trickle that the cattle had to work for. The men moved slower in the heat and drank more water and complained less than they had about the cold, because the cold had been dangerous and the heat was merely miserable, and there was a difference. Evelyn had learned the ranch's rhythms by then. She knew which men were going to push through an injury and which ones were going to come to her at the first sign of trouble. She knew the sound of the yard in the morning, the horses, the cook's fire, the particular creak of the bunkhouse door that meant the early risers were up. She knew which homesteads would need a visit before they sent for her, and which families would wait too long, and which ones still weren't sure about her. She was still building trust with some of them. That was honest. There were 2 families on the North Ridge who had sent their children to her when things were urgent, but who hadn't fully accepted the regularity of her rounds. The husband in both cases was the resistance, not the wife. And she made her visits and was professional and didn't press because pressing made it worse. Some things only moved at their own pace. But she had stopped doubting that she belonged here. That had happened somewhere in the cholera scare when she'd ridden back from the last farm on the South River in the rain and hadn't questioned, not once, whether she should have taken a different direction with her life. Wyoming had made room for her in a way that Boston never had. And she had made room for Wyoming in the same way. It wasn't sentiment, it was just the facts of where she was. The boy's name was Tommy Briggs. He was 17, dark-haired, with the kind of energy that made older men tired just watching him. He'd been on the ranch since March, Came from a family with too many mouths to feed up near the Montana border, hired on as a general hand. He worked hard, complained about nothing, and had a habit of taking on tasks that were slightly beyond what he'd been asked to do, which was both why the men liked him and why he occasionally caused problems. It was a Monday in late June when it happened. The hay press had been running since early morning. It was an older machine, heavy cast iron, a compression mechanism that required a team of 2 to operate safely, 3 to operate well. They had 2 that day because Reyes was out on the north fence and Connolly had gone to Millhaven for the supply run. Tommy had been running the feed side, which was supposed to be the simpler position, but at some point in the afternoon he'd moved to help clear a jam in the compression arm without shutting the machine down first. Evelyn was in the cabin when she heard it, not the accident itself. She didn't hear that. She heard the shouting, which was a particular kind of shouting, not the kind that came from frustration or anger, but the kind that came from men who were scared and needed to think fast and were doing both at the same time. She was out the door before she'd consciously decided to move. The press was 60 feet from the cabin. By the time she crossed the yard, 3 men were already there. Tommy was on the ground. The compression arm had caught his right arm and upper chest, and the force of it, when Deacon had thrown the release, had whipped him sideways and down. He was conscious, barely. His face was the color of old paper, and he was making a sound that was low and continuous and not quite words. She went to her knees beside him. "Tommy, look at me." His eyes moved to her. That was good. Eyes tracking. "Can you hear me?" "Yeah." A whisper. "Yeah, I hear you." She ran her hands over him fast and careful. Not gentle, not rough, but with the specific deliberate pressure of someone reading a body for information. She found what she was afraid of inside 20 seconds. The right arm was broken, probably in 2 places. The lower break bad enough that she could see the deformity through the sleeve. But the arm was not the problem. The problem was the chest. She pressed along his ribs and felt the displacement at the right side, felt the air movement under her hands when he tried to breathe. That was wrong, not symmetrical, not what it should be. Does it hurt to breathe? Everything hurts. Specifically, your chest, right side. Yeah. Deep breath, as deep as you can. He tried. He made a noise and stopped. She sat back on her heels and looked at his chest and thought, with the part of her mind that was always cold when it needed to be cold, hemopneumothorax, or close to it. Air in the chest cavity, possibly blood. You have maybe an hour before the lung compression becomes critical, less if the blood is accumulating fast. She stood up. "Get him to the cabin, carefully. Support his right side. Don't let anyone grab him under the arms. 4 of you. Move together, now." Deacon looked at her. "How bad is it?" "Move him." They moved him. Inside the cabin, she had him on the table in 3 minutes and was cutting his shirt away before the last man had cleared the doorway. She got the light she needed. 2 lanterns, one held by Marsh, who had come in from the yard and stationed himself without being asked. She assessed again, more thoroughly. The arm could wait. The chest was the immediate problem. "Is there a doctor in Millhaven?" she said. "Old Heller," Marsh said. "You said he was half blind." "He is. Anyone else in range?" "There's a surgeon in Cheyenne, I think. Day-and-a-half ride in good weather." She looked at Tommy. His lips were beginning to develop a faint blue tint at the edges. His breathing was shallow and effortful, and getting more so. She could hear the air moving wrong in his chest, a faint sucking quality on the right side that told her what she already knew. "Evelyn." Wade was at the door. He'd come in from the north pasture, and he was still dusty from the ride, and his voice was controlled but tight. "Tell me what we're dealing with." She told him. Not the technical version, the real version. Air is accumulating in the chest cavity on the right side. It's pressing on the lung, and it will press on the heart next. If I don't relieve the pressure, he will die. Not tomorrow, in the next hour. Wade looked at Tommy on the table, then at her. What do you need to do? I need to make an incision in the chest wall and insert a tube to let the air out. It's a procedure called thoracentesis. I've seen it done twice. I've assisted with it once. She held his gaze. I have not performed it myself. The room was very quiet. Wade, she said, I have to tell you this clearly. This is a surgical procedure. I am a nurse. If I do this, I am operating outside the legal boundaries of my certification. If something goes wrong, if you don't do it, he said, he dies. Yes. Then do it. I need you to understand what I'm telling you. I understand. He crossed to the table and put his hand on Tommy's shoulder, not holding him down, just contact, the kind a man gives to tell someone they're not alone. He looked at Evelyn. What do you need? She told him. She moved while she talked. The ether was on the shelf. The tube she needed was a modified piece of the rubber tubing she used for irrigation. The scalpel was in the instrument roll. She had done this in her head 100 times, not because she planned to need it, but because that was how she prepared for everything, running through the steps until they were part of her. Everyone except Marsh out, she said. They filed out. Marsh held the lantern. She worked. She would not remember all of it clearly afterward. That was how high-focus work went, the brain recording some things and skipping others, keeping what mattered and dropping the texture around it. She remembered Tommy's breathing changing when she made the incision and placed the tube, the sound of air releasing that was both alarming and exactly what she needed to hear. She remembered his color coming back, slow but real, the blue at his lips fading to something closer to normal. She remembered the arm, which she said after the chest was stable. The lower brake needed traction and alignment, and she did it by hand and feel, which hurt him despite the ether, and she could feel that in him, even unconscious. When she was done, she stood back from the table and looked at what she'd done and felt. Not triumph, not relief, not anything clean or simple. Just a shaking in her hands that had been there the whole time and had only now gotten her permission to show itself. Marsh lowered the lantern. His voice was quiet. He's breathing. Yes. You did that. Yes. She pressed her hands flat on the edge of the table until they stopped shaking. I need to monitor him tonight. I need someone to sit with him while I check his color and breathing every half hour. I need clean water and I need the chest tube kept clear. I'll sit with him. Marsh, I'll sit with him, Miss Harper. He said it in a way that ended the conversation. She washed her hands. She walked out of the cabin into the evening air, which was still warm, the sky going orange and purple to the west. The men were in the yard, all of them, which was unusual, most of them just standing. They looked at her when she came out. She said, He's alive. He needs rest and careful watching, but he's alive. The sound they made was not cheering. It was quieter than that. A collective exhale, some of them looking at the ground. Deacon turning away for a moment with his hand over his mouth. These were men who didn't express things easily, but they expressed it then. Wade was standing at the edge of the group. She walked to him. He's stable, she said. For now. The next 24 hours matter. I know. Wade, what I did in there, I know what you did. If anyone asks, no one is going to ask. His voice was level. Not from this ranch. She looked at him. There was something in his face that was more than gratitude and less than something she wasn't going to name right now, and she held herself steady against it the way she'd held herself steady against the shaking in her hands. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. She went back inside to watch her patient. Tommy Briggs was sitting up on the fourth day, demanding to know when he could go back to work, which Evelyn took as a reliable indicator of recovery. She told him 6 weeks minimum, and he told her that was impossible. And she told him it was 6 weeks or a permanent disability, his choice, and he went quiet and sulky in the way of healthy young men who had been forced to be still. The word moved fast, the way it always moved in open country. By the end of the first week, 3 homesteads had sent someone to ask about Tommy. By the end of the second week, people were talking about what had happened in the cabin on the Double C in terms that made Evelyn increasingly uncomfortable, because the words people were using were words like miracle and extraordinary, and those words attracted attention, and she had spent the last year trying very hard not to attract too much of the wrong kind. She had almost convinced herself it would be all right. The letter came in August. It arrived with the regular mail run from Mill Haven, a plain envelope, good paper, addressed to her by full name, which meant whoever sent it had known where she was and had taken the time to write it out formally. The return address was a law office in Denver. She opened it in the cabin, alone. It was 2 pages. Legal language, formal and precise. The substance of it was this: that the Wyoming Territorial Medical Board had received a formal complaint regarding unlicensed surgical practice at a private ranch in Laramie County. That the complaint had been filed by an attorney representing the interests of Dr. Victor Langston, senior surgeon, Massachusetts General Hospital. That the board intended to conduct an inquiry into the matter. That Evelyn Harper was required to appear before the board in Cheyenne within 45 days to respond to the complaint. There was a second paragraph that she read 3 times. It stated that if the inquiry determined she had practiced surgery without a license, she would be subject to a permanent bar from practicing any form of medicine in the Wyoming Territory, and potentially in any adjacent territory, at the board's discretion. She set the letter down on the table. She looked at the shelves she'd organized, the instruments in their roll, the patient log with 60-some entries in her careful handwriting. Her first instinct, the old instinct, the one she'd spent this whole year trying to wear down, was familiar. Pack the bag. Find the next train. Let it go before it gets worse. She sat with that instinct for a long time, long enough to feel it fully, which was important, because she'd learned that instincts you ignored without examining them had a way of coming back through the floor at the worst moment. She felt the fear in it. She acknowledged the fear. The fear was real, and it was reasonable, and it was not something to be ashamed of. And then she thought about Tommy Briggs sitting up on the 4th day demanding to know when he could work. She thought about Clara Henderson's hands holding hers after her daughter's leg was set. She thought about the cholera scare and the 10 days she'd moved through the South River farms in the rain, and the grandmother and 2 children who were sick and were not sick now. She thought about the letter from Langston sitting in her washstand drawer for 11 months, moving from the last thing I think about before sleep to something I know is there, and she thought about what that shift had cost her and what had made it possible. She thought about Langston, Victor Langston, who was sitting in a law office in Boston or Denver or wherever he spent his time, directing his attorney to write letters to territories he'd probably never visited, still doing what he had always done, using his position to reach across any distance and remind women who had inconvenienced him that he was more powerful than they were. She left the letter on the table and went to find Wade. He was at the barn, which was where he often was in the evening, doing the last checks before dark. She came in and stood in the middle of the aisle and waited for him to finish with the horse he was checking. When he turned, he looked at her face and said nothing for a moment. Then, "What happened?" she told him. He listened the whole way through without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, one hand on the stall door. Langston, he said, this is the man who took your license. Yes. And now he's found out you're here and what you did for Tommy, and he's using the territorial board as a mechanism to come after you again. That's what the letter means. Are you going to run? The question was direct. No softening, no polite framing, just the thing itself. No, she said. He nodded, like he'd expected that, or maybe like he'd hoped for it. Then we figure out what we're working with, he said. 45 days is enough time if we use it right. Do you know anyone in Cheyenne? A lawyer? Anyone connected to the territorial government? No. I do. He straightened up, moved out of the stall, closed it behind him. There's a man named Aldrich who handles land disputes for the territory. He owes me a favor from 3 years back. He's not a medical man, but he knows the board and he knows procedure. A favor. A significant one. He'll be motivated. He was already thinking forward. She could see it in his face, the way his attention had narrowed and sharpened. And we need to think about who has seen you work. Who would testify? Wade. 60 people in that patient log. Some of them won't want to be involved. Some of them will. He looked at her. Evelyn, you did not do anything wrong. You saved a boy's life and then kept saving lives for 6 months before that. The board needs to hear that from the people who were there, not just from you. She looked at him for a long moment in the warm light of the barn. She thought about what it felt like to stand in that cabin doorway in December and look at what she'd built and feel the small shift of something unlocking. She thought about what it would cost to lose it, and she thought about what it would cost to not fight for it. All right, she said, let's figure out what we're working with. Outside, the summer dark was settling over the ranch. The horses moved in their stalls. Somewhere across the yard, Tommy Briggs was probably arguing with Marsh about whether 6 weeks was really necessary. Evelyn stood in the barn with Wade and started thinking about how to fight. The 45 days moved fast and slow at the same time, the way time moves when something large is coming and you are trying to prepare for it without knowing exactly what shape it will take. Wade wrote to Aldrich in Cheyenne the morning after Evelyn told him about the letter. He didn't tell her what the favor was that Aldrich owed him, and she didn't ask because it wasn't relevant, and she had learned that Wade didn't offer information that wasn't relevant. Aldrich wrote back within the week. He was willing to represent her before the board. His letter was short and direct and said, among other things, that the filing from Langston's attorney had some procedural irregularities that he found interesting, which Evelyn took as a lawyer's way of saying there was something to work with. She kept working through all of it. She did not close the cabin, did not reduce her rounds, did not tell the homesteaders that anything had changed, partly because the work needed doing, partly because stopping felt like conceding something she wasn't ready to concede, and partly because she understood, had understood since the day she arrived in this territory with 11 cents and a dismissed letter, that the work was the argument. Not the only argument, but the foundation of everything else. Tommy Briggs was back on light duty by the 5th week, which was technically 1 week early, and the result of negotiations that Evelyn lost on a technicality when he demonstrated that he could walk the length of the yard without the chest tube sight causing him distress. She cleared him for light work with a list of restrictions longer than his arm, which he took from her solemnly and then probably summarized for Marsh as, "Don't lift anything heavy." "You know he's not following the full list," Marsh said to her one morning. "I know. You don't seem bothered." "He's healing well. The restrictions were conservative because conservative is how I stay out of trouble with a chest case." She glanced out the window toward the yard where Tommy was hauling a bucket that was not particularly light. "If he were doing poorly, I'd be bothered." Marsh watched him too. "He talks about you, you know, to anybody who'll listen, says you reached into his chest and pulled him back." "That's not what happened." "That's what it felt like from his end, I expect." She didn't answer that. She finished what she was doing and moved on to the next thing, which was preparing the patient log for Aldrich. He had asked for a full copy, every entry, dates, presenting complaints, treatments, outcomes. She spent 3 evenings going through it carefully, writing a clean copy in her best hand, adding notations where the original was abbreviated. 67 entries by the time she finished. She looked at those pages for a long time before she sent them. 67 people. 67 separate moments where someone had been in pain or fear or the kind of quiet desperation that comes from being too far from help for too long, and she had been the help. She did not feel proud of the list exactly. What she felt was the weight of it. Not a bad weight, but a real one. The understanding that these 67 entries were what the hearing was actually about, whatever legal language Langston's attorney had wrapped around it. Wade rode to Cheyenne 10 days before the hearing to meet with Aldrich in person. He was gone 4 days. When he came back, he found her in the cabin and sat down across the table and told her what he'd learned. Langston filed through an intermediary chasseur, he said. A colleague of his in Denver, a man named Price, who sits on the Western Division of the National Medical Board. Price made the formal complaint to the Wyoming Territorial Board on Langston's behalf, which keeps Langston's name one step removed from the action. That's how he works, Evelyn said. He's careful that way. Aldrich thinks it's also how he's made mistakes in the past. The separation between Langston and the actual complaint means there's a paper trail that goes through Price, and Price has his own history with the board that Aldrich finds worth looking into. What kind of history? That's what Aldrich is looking into. Wade set his hat on the table. He looked tired from the ride, but his attention was fully present. What matters for the hearing is this. The charge against you is unlicensed surgical practice. The board can only sanction you if they determine that what you did constitutes surgery rather than emergency nursing intervention, and that determination depends heavily on context. Aldrich believes that if we present the full picture of what you've built here, the cabin, the rounds, the 67 patients, and specifically Tommy, we have a reasonable argument that the territorial board should be recognizing your work rather than punishing it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Reasonable argument. He said that. Not a guaranteed outcome. I know what reasonable argument means. She looked at the table. What does he need from me beyond the log? Witnesses. As many as will come. People who can speak to what you did for them, in their own words, in front of the board. Wade held her gaze. I've already talked to Pruitt. He said yes before I finished asking. The Henderson family said yes. Marsh said yes, and Connolly. Tommy, obviously. Tommy shouldn't travel yet. Tommy is going to Cheyenne whether you clear him or not. He told me to tell you that specifically. She almost smiled. Almost. Who else? That's the part I wanted to talk to you about. There are people on your list who I don't know well enough to approach directly. The homesteaders on the North Ridge, the Taggart family from the cholera situation, the river farms. He paused. I think those conversations need to come from you. She nodded. She'd known that even before he said it. The next 10 days were the hardest days of the 45. Not because they were the most frightening, but because they required something from her that she was less practiced at than anything medical. She had to ask for help. Directly, personally, looking people in the eye and telling them what was happening and what she needed from them, which meant telling them things about her past that she had not volunteered to anyone except Wade. She started with the Taggart farm. Old Taggart, his name was Bernard, but no one called him that, met her at his gate on a gray morning and listened while she told him about the hearing in Cheyenne and what it meant and what she was asking. He was a man of about 60 with a face that had been weathered into something close to permanence, and he didn't change expression much while she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. This Langston fellow, he said, he's the one who ended your career in Boston. Yes. And now he's reached all the way out here to try to do it again. That's the situation. Taggart looked past her toward the fields. My wife and my 2 grandchildren are alive because you came out here in the rain and told me the truth about my water and made me listen. He paused. I don't know anything about medical licensing boards, but I can get on a horse and ride to Cheyenne and say what happened. That much I can do. She had not expected it to be that simple with him. She had prepared for resistance, for negotiation, for people weighing their own concerns against her need. Taggart's directness undid her for a moment, and she pressed her lips together and looked at his fence post and got herself back. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me for telling the truth, he said. That's just what a person does. Clara Henderson said yes with both hands gripping Evelyn's arms and her voice shaking slightly. She said she would bring her daughter, who was walking normally now, and she would stand in front of any board in any territory and say what she needed to say. The 2 North Ridge families surprised her. The resistant husbands, the ones she'd given up on converting, both said yes. One of them gruffly and with apparent discomfort, but yes. The other told her, with the careful embarrassment of a man admitting something he'd rather not, that his wife had been sick for a month before Evelyn's visit the previous spring and had been too scared to tell him how sick, and that he understood now what would have happened if Evelyn hadn't come when she did. She rode back from the North Ridge late that afternoon with 14 confirmed witnesses, and she stopped on the rise above the ranch and looked down at the buildings below. The main house, the barn, the bunkhouse, the small cabin with the overhang bench that Wade had built, and felt something shift in her chest that was not the way she was used to feeling things. It was larger than she had room for, whatever it was, and she sat on her horse for a moment in the cooling air and let it settle before she rode down. Wade was in the yard when she came in. He read her face the way he had learned to read it, not intrusively, not with questions, just attention. 14, she said. Something in his expression opened up. 14, and Aldrich has the log and the case files. So, she dismounted and handed him the reins, not because she needed to, but because it was a habit now, the small exchanges of daily life on a working ranch that had become the texture of her days here. I think we're as ready as we're going to be. He held the horse and looked at her. You're not scared. It wasn't quite a question. I'm scared, she said. I'm just not letting it make the decisions. He was quiet for a moment, holding the reins, the horse moving slightly beside him. The evening light was flat and gold across the yard. She could hear the cook inside, something on the stove. Evelyn, he said. She waited. Whatever happens in Cheyenne, he stopped, started differently. What you've built here, the cabin, the rounds, the people whose lives are different because of you. That's real regardless of what any board decides. They can take a certification. They can't take what actually happened. She looked at him for a long moment. 11 years of having her work defined by other people's assessments of it, by certificates and approvals and the permission of men who had authority over what she was allowed to do and call herself. The idea that what actually happened was the real thing, not the paper version of it, was not a new idea. But hearing it said plainly by someone who had watched her work and meant it literally was something else. I know, she said, but I'd like the paper version too. He almost smiled. Fair enough. They rode to Cheyenne 3 days before the hearing. Wade, Evelyn, Marsh, and Deacon, who had appointed himself to the party without being invited, and whose presence Evelyn found, against her expectations, steadying. Tommy Briggs was already there, having ridden ahead with Reyes, defying every restriction she'd given him, and apparently suffering no consequences for it, which she chose to read as further evidence of his recovery rather than as a failure of her instructions. Aldrich met them in the hotel. He was a compact man in his 40s, precise in his movements, with the particular calm of someone who had spent many years in rooms where things were decided and had learned that calm was a strategic asset. He went over the procedure with Evelyn that evening at a table in the hotel's small meeting room, laying out how the hearing would run, what the board was likely to ask, what Langston's attorney, a man named Garvey, who had come from Denver for the occasion, was likely to argue. Garvey will focus on the technical definition of surgery, Aldrich said. He'll argue that thoracentesis with incision and tube insertion is unambiguously a surgical procedure and that no interpretation of nursing scope includes it. He's not entirely wrong, Evelyn said. No, he's not. Aldrich met her eyes. Which is why we're not arguing that he is. We're arguing context, we're arguing necessity, and we're arguing that the Wyoming Territory has a specific medical reality that the board has an obligation to account for. What's the board's general disposition toward those kinds of arguments? Mixed. 3 of the 5 members are reasonable men who understand frontier medicine. One of them is a formalist who will follow the technical argument wherever it leads. One of them, Aldrich paused. One of them has been on the board for 12 years, and I have reason to believe he was contacted by Price before the complaint was formally filed. The room was quiet. Contacted how? Wade said. I'm still working on that. What I know is that he filed a procedural motion supporting fast-tracking this hearing, which is unusual for a complaint of this type. Fast-tracking limits preparation time and limits public attention. Aldrich looked at Evelyn. The good news is that it didn't work the way they intended. You had enough time to prepare, and the witnesses you've assembled are... He stopped, searched for the right word. Compelling, quantitatively and qualitatively. What about Langston himself? Evelyn asked. Is he here? He's not attending in person. Garvey is acting on his behalf. And the Price connection? Aldrich folded his hands on the table. I received some documents from Boston yesterday. They arrived by telegraph relay. Someone there was willing to put information in writing, someone who has worked under Langston and has their own reasons for wanting his methods examined. He looked at her carefully. There are at least 2 cases before Tommy Briggs where Langston appears to have used his position on Eastern licensing boards to silence criticism. One of them involved a hospital administrator who questioned his surgical outcomes. The other involved a younger surgeon who reported a medication error in Langston's operating room. Evelyn felt something cold move through her. What happened to them? The administrator lost her position. The surgeon lost his license in 3 states. Aldrich paused. Both cases show the same pattern as yours. Formal complaints filed through intermediaries, procedural pressure, speed. She had known it, in the way you know something you've been told but haven't fully believed. Hearing it confirmed in Aldrich's flat, careful voice made it real in a different way. He does this routinely, she said. It appears so. She sat with that. She thought about the years she'd spent moving westward, each stage of the journey costing something, the money going first, and then the pride, and then the direction, until she was sitting in a Wyoming train station not knowing if she had enough strength left to be afraid. She thought about all the people who had stayed in Boston, or wherever they were, and absorbed what Langston did to them and did not have a train to take in the wrong direction. Can we use that in the hearing? Wade asked. The direct relevance to this case is limited, Aldrich said. But pattern of conduct is an argument, and the board has the discretion to consider it if they choose to. He looked at his hands. More importantly, those documents may be of interest to the National Medical Board separately from this hearing. That's a longer process, but it's a process. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in a building on the main street of Cheyenne that served multiple government functions and smelled of old paper and floor wax. The board sat at a raised table, 5 men, the formalist identifiable immediately by the way he arranged his papers before anyone had said a word, The suspected Langston contact identifiable by the fact that he did not look at Evelyn when she entered the room. The gallery was not large. It was full anyway. Taggart was there. The Hendersons. Clara with her daughter who walked in on her own two legs and sat in the front row. The North Ridge families. The River Farmers. Connolly, Marsh, Deacon. Tommy Briggs, who was pale from the travel but upright and present, wearing a clean shirt that someone had clearly pressed for him. Garvey was good. Evelyn gave him that. He was precise and well-prepared, and his argument was structurally clean. Nursing scope did not include surgical incision. The procedure performed on Thomas Briggs met every technical definition of surgery. The nurse in question had a prior history of operating outside her professional boundaries, and the territorial board had both the authority and the obligation to act. He was good. He was also arguing in a room full of people who had ridden hours to be there, and the weight of their presence was something his technical language could not fully account for. Aldrich presented his case methodically. He walked through the patient log. He presented the geographic reality of medical care in the Wyoming Territory, distances, conditions, the gap between what existed and what was needed. He called witnesses. Taggart testified. He was short and factual, and when the formalist board member asked whether he understood the legal distinction between a nurse and a surgeon, he said, "I understand that my wife is alive. That's what I understand." And the room was very quiet. Clara Henderson testified. She described her daughter's injury and the 6 hours before Evelyn arrived and what she saw in the room when Evelyn worked, and her voice only broke once, briefly, and she steadied it herself. Tommy testified last among the patients. He was 17 years old, and he sat in the witness chair with the careful posture of someone who was trying to look older than he was. And he described what he remembered, which was not much. Most of it was gone. And then he said, "She stayed with me the whole night after. Marsh told me. She checked my breathing every half hour until morning." He paused. "I don't know what she is legally. I know she's the reason I'm sitting here." The formalist board member pressed him on whether he understood that unlicensed practice created risk. Tommy looked at him evenly and said, "The risk I understood was dying. She addressed that risk." Then Aldrich presented the Boston documents. He did not overplay them. He laid them out plainly. The pattern, the cases, the intermediary complaints. He did not accuse Langston of criminal conduct in this room. He presented the evidence and let the board read what was in front of them. The Langston contact on the board, the one who had not looked at Evelyn when she entered, looked at his papers for a long time after Aldrich finished. He did not say anything during the questioning that followed. Garvey objected to the relevance of the Boston documents. The board chair overruled him after a brief discussion among the 5 men that Evelyn could not hear from where she sat. The hearing lasted 4 hours. The board recessed at noon. Evelyn sat in the hallway outside on a wooden bench with Wade on one side and Marsh on the other, and she stared at the floor and did not say much. Clara Henderson brought her a cup of coffee from somewhere, set it in her hands, and sat across from her without saying anything either. Tommy was asleep in a chair at the end of the hall, which was the right thing for his chest and also the most 17-year-old thing she had ever seen. Wade said quietly, at some point during the wait, "Whatever they decide, you fought." "I know. That's different from before." She thought about the train station in December, the bench and the cold stove and the numb hands and the letter in her bag that had felt like the whole story of who she was. "Yes," she said, "it's different from before." The board was in recess for 2 hours and 17 minutes. When they came back, the chair read the ruling in a flat official voice that was probably meant to sound neutral, but which Evelyn, sitting rigid in her chair, could not make herself hear as neutral regardless of his intention. The board found that the circumstances of the Briggs emergency presented conditions consistent with the frontier necessity doctrine as recognized under territorial medical practice provisions. They found that the preponderance of evidence demonstrated that Evelyn Harper had provided sustained, skilled, and essential medical care to an underserved population over a documented period. They found the complaint as filed insufficient to justify sanctions. The complaint was dismissed. There was a sound in the room, not the dramatic kind, not what you'd hear in a theater, just the sound of people who had been holding something very tightly, letting it go all at once. Evelyn sat still for a moment. She felt Wade's hand cover hers on the armrest, briefly, just for a second, and then he took it away. She didn't look at him. She looked at the board table and at the words that had just been spoken and let them settle into something real. Garvey was already gathering his papers. He did it efficiently, without looking at anyone in the room, and was out the door within 2 minutes, which told her everything she needed to know about how confident Langston had been. She stood up slowly. Clara Henderson was right there. She took Evelyn's hands again, the way she had in the farmhouse after her daughter's leg, both hands, holding on. Her eyes were wet, and she was not trying to hide it. "Come on," Wade said from beside her. "Let's go home." She turned to look at him. The word home sat differently than it had a year ago, differently than it had in Boston, differently than it had in any of the places she'd stopped on the way west. It sat like something that had been true for a while and had only now been given its right name. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." They rode back to the Double C in 2 days, the same road they'd come down, but it felt different going the other direction. Not easier. The road was still the road, the horses still needed rest, Tommy still needed watching, even though he pretended not to, but lighter somehow, in the way that the same weight carried downhill feels less than the same weight carried up. Nobody talked much on the first day. That was all right. Evelyn had noticed that the people on this ranch communicated as much through silence as through words, and she had learned to read the silences. This one was the kind that comes after something large has passed. Not emptiness, but rest. The kind of quiet a person earns. Marsh rode beside her for a stretch in the afternoon and said, after about 2 miles of nothing, "Taggart was something, wasn't he, when that board member asked him about the legal distinction?" "He was," Evelyn said. "I don't know that I could have said it that cleanly. You testified well. I just told them what happened." "That's what testifying well means." Marsh thought about that. "Huh." He was quiet for another mile. "You think Langston knows yet?" Garvey was probably on a telegraph wire within the hour. "Think he'll try again?" She considered it honestly. Not the version she wanted to be true, but the actual version. "I think Aldrich's documents going to the National Board will occupy his attention more than I will. He has larger problems now than one nurse in Wyoming." She paused. "But I've been wrong about him before." "Wrong about?" Marsh nodded. "He didn't push it further. After a while he dropped back to ride with Connolly, and she was alone with the road ahead of her and the sound of hooves on dry ground." Wade rode up to take the space Marsh had left. He did it without comment, which was how he did most things. They rode together for a time without speaking, and Evelyn found, as she had found increasingly over the past months, that his presence beside her was something she had stopped noticing as remarkable and started noticing as simply part of what a day felt like. "You're thinking," he said eventually. "I'm always thinking. This is a different kind of thinking." She looked at the horizon. The late afternoon light was stretching everything long and gold across the plain. "I want to do something with what happened in that hearing room," she said. "Not the ruling itself, the thing that made the ruling possible. Meaning the witnesses. Meaning all of it. The log. The 67 people. The fact that the board had a doctrine they could apply because there is a recognized reality about this territory and what it needs. She turned to look at him. There are women in this territory, not just in my county, in every county, who know things. Midwives who've been delivering babies for 20 years, women who've been the only medical care in 50 miles for their entire lives. They know what they're doing, and they have no standing, no training formally recognized, no protection when someone decides to question them the way Langston questioned me. Wade listened. The cabin at the Double C started because you had an old medical setup and 2 sick men in a blizzard, she said. That's not a system, that's luck. If I want what I built to mean something beyond my own survival, it has to be something other people can build too. He was quiet for a moment. What does that look like? A training program, structured, documented, something that produces women who can do what I do and have paper to show for it. Not a hospital. This isn't Boston. It needs to work in a cabin and on a trail and in someone's kitchen. Practical knowledge, emergency procedures, sanitation, the specific things that kill people out here. She heard herself talking faster and pulled it back. I don't know exactly what it looks like yet. I know what problem it solves. Wade rode beside her for a while without speaking. She had learned that his silences were not hesitation. They were how he processed things fully before he responded, which she had come to find more trustworthy than quick answers. You'd need a second cabin, he said finally, or a bigger one. The current setup is too small for teaching. She looked at him. I haven't asked you for anything. You haven't asked me yet, he said. I'm just thinking ahead. She didn't answer. She faced the road and felt something move in her chest that she was not going to examine too carefully on horseback in the open, but that she acknowledged was there. They got home after dark on the second day. The ranch looked the way it always looked at night. The windows warm, the barn dark, the dogs coming out to meet the horses at the gate. Evelyn stood in the yard for a moment after she'd dismounted and looked at it all, and she thought about the first time she'd seen it through a blizzard, a collection of lights that became buildings, and how she hadn't known what it was yet. Now she knew exactly what it was. She went to check on the cabin before she went inside, just to see it. She unlocked the door and held her lamp up and looked at the table and the shelves and the patient log sitting where she'd left it, and she thought, this is where it started. Whatever comes next starts here too. She locked the door and went to bed. The letter from Aldrich came 3 weeks later. It was longer than his previous letters. He wrote that the Boston documents had been formally submitted to the National Medical Board's Review Committee, along with statements from 2 individuals in Massachusetts who had come forward after news of the Cheyenne hearing had traveled, in the way that news traveled, through connections and word of mouth, and the small world of people who knew each other's professional histories. The review committee had opened a formal inquiry into Dr. Victor Langston's conduct across 4 licensing jurisdictions. Aldrich wrote with characteristic precision that this process would be slow and that its outcome was uncertain, but that the pattern of evidence was substantial and that the committee appeared to be taking it seriously. He also wrote in his last paragraph that he had spoken to a member of the territorial governor's office who had attended the Cheyenne hearing. The governor's office was interested in discussing the question of medical training and licensure for frontier practitioners. If Miss Harper was willing, they would welcome a meeting at her convenience. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and sat with it for a while. She thought about Langston. She tried to locate in herself some version of satisfaction or vindication and found something more complicated. Not the clean feeling she might have wanted, but something closer to the truth. He would face a process. That process would be slow and administrative, and he would have lawyers and the accumulated protection of his position and his reputation. He might not lose everything. He might find a way through it with less damage than he deserved. That was the way of powerful men and institutional processes, and she had lived long enough to know it. But the inquiry was real. The people who had come forward were real. Whatever Langston had done to her, and to the administrator, and to the young surgeon in Boston, those things were now part of a record that had not existed before, and records had a way of persisting. She could not control the outcome. She could acknowledge that the machinery of accountability, slow and imperfect as it was, had been set in motion. That was not nothing. She wrote to Aldrich that afternoon. She told him she was willing to meet with the governor's office. She told him what she had in mind. The planning took most of the fall. It was not simple planning. Building something real never was. She spent October and November in conversations with Wade, with Aldrich, with Clara Henderson, who turned out to have a sharp and practical mind when applied to organizational questions, with two women she'd identified through her rounds who had exactly the kind of experience and existing knowledge she was looking for. The first was a woman named Ruth Sawyer, who was 51 years old and had been the only medical resource for a cluster of homesteads in the northwest corner of the county for 15 years. Ruth had learned from her mother, who had learned from necessity, and she had a practical knowledge of wound care and obstetrics and fever management that was better than many trained nurses Evelyn had worked alongside in Boston. She also had no formal standing whatsoever. The second was a younger woman, 26, named Ida Crane, who had come west with her husband 3 years ago from Ohio, where she had spent 1 year in a nursing training program before the money ran out. She knew the foundations but had never had the resources to continue. She was sharp, fast, and had a willingness to be wrong and corrected that Evelyn valued more than confidence. She brought them both to the Double C in November, and they sat at the table in the main house, she, Wade, Ruth, and Ida, and she laid out what she was thinking. "I want to be clear about what this isn't," she said. "This isn't a hospital. This isn't a formal nursing school in the Eastern sense. It can't be. And trying to make it, that would just make it not work in the places it needs to work." She looked at Ruth. "What you know, the things you've developed over 15 years, I want to be able to teach that to someone in 3 months. Not everything, but the core of it. Emergency trauma, childbirth complications, infection management, the specific things that kill people before help can arrive." Ruth looked at her steadily. "You think 3 months is enough? For a foundation, with continued mentorship? Yes. The women who complete a training cycle would go back to their areas and continue building. They'd have someone to write to with questions. They'd be part of a network. Who's going to recognize this training? If what happened to you happens to one of them, that's what the meeting with the governor's office is about," Evelyn said. "I want a territorial certification that covers frontier medical practice, something with standing that isn't Boston's framework dropped onto Wyoming's reality." Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, which were the hands of a woman who had used them for hard work for 50 years. Then she looked at Evelyn. "I'm in," she said. "I've watched 2 women die in the last 4 years from things that didn't have to kill them. If there'd been someone closer who knew what to do—" She stopped. "I'm in." Ida said, "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to help me build the curriculum. You know the formal structure. I know the frontier realities. Together we can probably produce something that's actually usable." Ida pulled a small notebook from her pocket. She had apparently brought it in anticipation of exactly this. "When do we start?" Evelyn looked around the table. Wade was watching her with the expression she knew by now. The one that was just attention, fully present, not performing anything. Clara was nodding slowly. Ruth was already turning something over in her mind. "We start now," Evelyn said. The second cabin went up in December, which meant it went up in cold that slowed everything and required twice the labor. But Wade had his own reasons for wanting it finished before winter deepened, and he drove the timeline with the particular focused energy he gave to things he had decided mattered. The men helped without being asked twice. Deacon turned out to have real carpentry skill that he'd never mentioned, and Connolly worked with the kind of thoroughness that came from a man who remembered what it was like to be sick in a bunkhouse and have someone who knew what she was doing show up. It was larger than the first cabin. A proper teaching space, the table built longer, the shelving built for demonstration materials, a separate section with cots for extended care cases. It was connected to the original cabin by a covered walkway that was Wade's addition. His reasoning being that moving between the two spaces in a Wyoming winter without a covered walkway was just poor planning, which she couldn't argue with. They opened the first training cycle in February of 1889. 6 women the first cycle. They came from across the territory, 2 from within the county, 1 from as far as the Montana border, 1 who had traveled with her husband's freight wagon and planned to return the same way. They ranged in age from 19 to 53. They had different amounts of prior knowledge, different backgrounds, different reasons for being there. What they had in common was that they were the people their communities turned to when something went wrong, and they were doing it without any of the tools or recognition or support that the work required. Evelyn taught. Ruth taught alongside her. Ida ran the curriculum structure and kept the documentation and was, it turned out, a natural teacher in a way that she hadn't fully known about herself. Patient, precise, with a gift for finding the explanation that clicked for a specific person. They argued sometimes, the 3 of them, about approach and emphasis and the right way to teach a particular skill, and the arguments were the kind that made the teaching better. The days were long and the work was dense, and not all of it went well. One of the women in the first cycle left after 3 weeks. The distance from home was harder than she'd expected, and her youngest was sick. Evelyn did not make her feel ashamed of leaving. She gave her materials to take with her and told her the door was open when she was ready, and meant it. 2 of the remaining 5 had a conflict in the 5th week over a procedural disagreement that became briefly personal before Evelyn sat them both down and said, plainly, that she didn't have room in the program for either ego or avoidance, and that if they couldn't resolve it professionally, she would need to reconsider both of their places in the cycle. They resolved it. By the end of the first cycle, 5 women had completed the training. They went back to their communities with documentation, with a list of each other's names and locations, and with the understanding that they were connected to something larger than their individual patches of territory. The second cycle had 8 women. The third, 12. The meeting with the governor's office happened in March of 1889, and it was less confrontational than Evelyn had prepared for. The man they sent was a pragmatist who had read Aldrich's summary of the Cheyenne hearing and who understood, with the directness of a man who dealt with real problems rather than theoretical ones, that the territory had a medical reality that was not being addressed by existing frameworks. He didn't give her everything she asked for. He gave her most of it. A provisional certification for frontier medical practitioners reviewed annually with defined scope of practice that was broader than anything on the Eastern Seabooks and narrower than a physician's license, something that existed in the actual space between the two, which was where the work happened. It required documentation of training and supervised practice, and it had standards that she had helped write. It was imperfect. She knew it was imperfect the day she held the signed document. The scope was in places more restricted than the reality demanded. The renewal requirements would burden women in remote areas. There would be cases, she could already see them in the future, where the line between what was permitted and what was necessary would be exactly the wrong line. But it was real. It was standing. It was a document that said, These women exist, what they do matters, and the territory recognizes them. She put it on the wall of the original cabin, next to the patient log from the first year. Langston lost his hospital privileges in 2 states in the spring of 1890. The National Board inquiry concluded the following year with a formal censure and a license restriction that ended his surgical practice. Aldrich wrote to tell her. His letter was factual and brief because he was a factual and brief man, and she appreciated that he hadn't dressed it up. She sat with the news for a day before she told anyone. She sat with it the same way she'd sat with the letter from the governor's office. Not with celebration, not with the clean satisfaction she'd sometimes imagined, but with something quieter and more complicated. Relief, partly. Grief, in a way she hadn't expected, not for him, but for the years she'd spent afraid of him, and for the people in Boston who had been through the same machinery and had not had a Wyoming to run to. Anger still, at the distance between what had happened to him and what he had done. And underneath all of it, something steady. She went to find Wade. He was where he often was in the early afternoon, out near the north pasture checking the fence line that always needed checking. She rode out to him and told him. He listened and then was quiet for a moment, looking at the fence post he'd been examining. "How do you feel?" he said. It was not a question he asked often. He was a man who respected that feelings were private unless offered, which meant when he asked, he actually wanted to know. "Like it's over," she said. The part that was about him. "I want to be done spending energy on what Victor Langston deserved or didn't deserve." She paused. "I want to focus on what's ahead." He looked at her then. The afternoon light was flat across the grass, and she could see him clearly. The lines of his face, the particular way he held himself when he was paying full attention, which was different from the way most people paid attention because it didn't perform itself. "Evelyn," he said, "I have been trying to find the right time to say something for about 8 months. She waited. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want to be honest about that up front." "I know." "I think you know what I want to say." "I think I do." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like you to stay. Not because of the cabin or the program or the work, though all of that matters, because of you specifically." He stopped. "I'm not asking you to change what you're building. I'm asking if I can be part of it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the train station and the blizzard and the way she'd looked at his face in the lamplight of the bunkhouse and filed away difficult to read as something to pay attention to. She thought about the bench he'd built without telling her, and the ride to Cheyenne, and his hand covering hers for 1 second in the hearing room before he took it away. She thought about the person she'd been when she arrived. Not the brave version, not the version the story might want her to have been, but the actual version. Tired, broke, frostbitten, running on stubbornness because everything else had run out. She thought about what it had taken to become someone who could stand in that courtroom and not run. Some of that had been him. Not because he'd saved her. She didn't need that story, and it wasn't true anyway. But because he had given her space to do it herself, and there was a kind of love in that which she had not previously known how to recognize. "I'm not easy to live alongside," she said. "I need to say that plainly." "I know that. I have opinions about everything, and I don't conceal them, and there will be times when I'm wrong, and I will find that deeply annoying." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I've noticed. I'm also going to keep building. The program is going to grow. There will be travel and late nights and people showing up at inconvenient hours. That doesn't change. I'm not asking it to change." She looked at the fence line stretching out behind him, the grass moving in the wind, the sky going from blue to something more complicated toward the west. She thought about what it meant to belong somewhere. Not the tidy version, Not the version where a person arrives and is claimed and everything settles into place. The real version, which was harder and more gradual and involved making choices over and over daily about what mattered and what you were willing to fight for. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right. Don't make it more complicated than it is." "I wasn't going to." She turned her horse, and they rode back to the ranch together, and it was not different from any of the other times they had ridden back together, except that it was completely different, and she let herself know that. The program ran for 6 years before it became something with a name and a formal structure. The Frontier Medical Training Program, chartered by the territory, operating out of the Double C with satellite training at 3 locations in neighboring counties. By 1895, it had trained 64 women. By 1897, over 100. Ruth Sawyer taught until she was 60. And then she told Evelyn she was done riding in the winter. And Evelyn said that was more than fair, and Ruth stayed on as a resident instructor, which was better for everyone. Ida Crane eventually took on the role of program director. She had the administrative mind for it, and the personal authority that came from genuinely knowing what she was talking about. And Evelyn moved into the work she found she was best suited for, which was teaching the hardest cases, the things that required not just knowledge, but judgment. The difference between what the book said and what the patient in front of you was telling you. Tommy Briggs, for the record, eventually became a land surveyor and married a woman from Casper who was one of the program's graduates, which Evelyn found quietly satisfying in a way she never mentioned to him because he would have been insufferable about it. Deacon stayed on the Double C. Marsh went north to his own ranch somewhere around 1891 and wrote occasionally. Connolly moved to Mill Haven and became, improbably, the town's first elected mayor, which Evelyn always cited as evidence that recovering from pneumonia built character. The letter from Langston, the one she'd kept in her washstand drawer, the one that had ridden with her all the way from Boston to Wyoming, she burned in the stove in the original cabin on a February morning in 1890, after she'd heard about his censure. Not ceremonially. She just looked at it one morning and decided she was done carrying it and put it in the fire and watched it go. It made a small flame and then nothing. She went to work. What she had learned in 11 years of nursing and 1 winter in Wyoming and everything that followed was this. The story you are told about yourself by the people who have power over you is not the true story. It is their story, shaped by their needs and their fears and what it costs them to see you clearly. Langston had told her she was a problem, insubordinate, a loose end. He had told that story to enough people in the right rooms, and for a time it had felt like the only story there was, because that is what happens when a powerful person controls the official record. But the official record is not the same as what actually happened. What actually happened was 67 names in a patient log. What actually happened was a boy who breathed when he hadn't been going to. What actually happened was Clara Henderson's daughter walking into a Cheyenne hearing room on her own 2 legs. What actually happened was 64 women who went back to their communities knowing something they hadn't known before, and the people those women reached, and the people after that. What actually happened was a woman who arrived in Wyoming with 11 cents and a letter that told her she was finished, and who built something anyway. Not because she was extraordinary, she would have rejected that framing firmly, but because the need was there, and she had the skills, and she refused in the end to let someone else's story about her determine what she did with her hands. There is something particular about the kind of place Wyoming was in those years. Hard, cold, largely indifferent to individual survival, that had a way of cutting through the noise. Out there, the question of what you were worth was answered by what you actually did. Not what you were certified to do, not what title you held, not who'd given you permission. What you did with your hands in the specific moment when it mattered. Evelyn Harper had spent years in a world that asked for credentials before it asked for competence. Wyoming had asked only, "Can you help?" She could. She did. That's the whole story, or as much of it as fits in words. A woman came west with nothing and built something. She was not perfect. She was afraid more often than she admitted. She made mistakes. There were patients she couldn't help, calls she second-guessed, nights when she lay awake wondering if she'd done the right thing in a given moment. She argued with people she cared about, and was sometimes wrong about things she'd been certain of. She was, in other words, a person doing the work of a person, in the imperfect and ongoing way that work actually gets done. And years later, when the women she'd trained other women, and those women went to places Evelyn had never seen, carrying knowledge she'd helped build, she understood something she'd not had the language for when she was sitting on that bench in the Millhaven train station, wondering if anything she'd done had mattered. It wasn't about surviving what tried to destroy you. Survival is the beginning, not the achievement. The achievement is what you build in the space that survival gives you. The scars don't disappear. She knew that. Wade knew it. Ruth knew it. Everyone who had lived a real life rather than a managed one knew it. But scars are information too. They tell you where you've been and what you're made of and where the strength actually came from. She'd been made of more than she knew. She was glad she'd found out.